Good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Sterling, the Mid-Atlantic Senior Regional Director for the National Parks Conservation Association. And it is an absolute honor today to be joined here by these very esteemed. This is a stellar panel. There's so many of you were in this film, I feel like it's like inside the actor's studio here now to talk about this. So just to do some brief introductions, we have Stephanie Deutsch, the author of You Need a Schoolhouse, and very, probably one of the foremost historians on the Rosenwald story. We have Sharon Davies, the president and CEO of the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We have Mr. Newell E. Quinton of the John Quinton Foundation and San Domingo School, and a real Renaissance man, actually. He's such an amazing background. And then, of course, Dorothy Cantor, the president of the Rosenwald campaign. But I'll let you all introduce each other before we go around, and I'd like for you each, you have to turn on your microphone by pressing the push button. And I'd love for you all to just go down and just kind of share a little bit. You know, Dorothy, you talked about the amazing diversity of people who have been brought to this story, but I'd love for you all each to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about how you became connected with this effort, if you wouldn't mind. We'll start with you.
Well, for those of you who have heard it before, maybe many times, I apologize. But it was like a sleepy Saturday afternoon in September of 2015. And my late husband and I wanted to see a movie. And there was no movie that we could agree to see. And I just happened to look in the weekend section of the Washington Post, and there was a little article about this new documentary called Rosenwald. And neither Jerry nor I had ever heard of Julius Rosenwald. We're Jewish, but we had never heard of him. We always associated Sears Roebuck with being a very waspy organization, which, by the way, it became. With Julius Rosenwald's knowledge and approval. And so we went to see it. And at the end of the 90-minute film, I turned to Jerry and I said, there needs to be a national park for Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. And so, why did I say that? I didn't know anything about Julius Rosenwald, but I did know a lot about national parks because I had been on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association for a number of years. And they never have gotten rid of me. I'm still working for them, and sometimes they tolerate me. And so that's how it started, because I knew a lot about national parks, and I knew there wasn't one national park that told the story of a Jewish American or the story of the importance of Rosenwald schools. So that's how it began, and there's somebody in the audience who was at the original meeting, the kickoff, almost a year later, and he knows who he is. There were 4 of us. And you and I are the only 2 who are here tonight, but that's how it started. And Stephanie was one of the original people to join the campaign. There are others here on the board. I thank them for coming. Curtis Valentine, Carol Schull from the National Park Service, Jordan Tenenbaum, and anybody I've missed, excuse me. So that's how it began.
I got involved with the restoration of the Rosenwald School because it was a landmark for our community, and everyone in our little community had a part or knew of attending that school and the importance of it. And this is a short story that I will tell you. One day, after retiring and going back home, I looked at the building and I asked our kids in the community, what are you doing? And unfortunately, the kids responded to me, there's nothing here to do. And they said, what's the story with this old building here? Why don't we make this building a fun place or a museum? And so that reminded me of all the activities that I had at that school. I attended the school from 1950 through 1956, and it was a loving place, a place for caring, and a place that we felt very safe at and knew that we were obligated to attend every day because of our parents insisted that we make every possible sacrifice to get an education because they did not. And so that was always there, the importance of education. So lo and behold, it took me back to those days at the school. Well, I said, gee, well, We should not leave the school in ruins. We should take the kids on their thought and do something with the building. And beginning the process of restoring the building, I really went to Maryland Arts and Humanities and said, the kids in our community would like to start a museum, and we have an old building there. Will you help us restore it? And the people in charge of the Maryland Arts and Humanities says, what are you working with? And of course, my response was an old school building. And the people there said, is it a Rosenwald school? And of course, going to school in those days, we had not heard of Rosenwald. All we knew was you had to go to school to get an education if you expected to succeed in life. And that was sacred in our home for all of us, being 8 siblings. So when Maryland Arts and Humanities questioned me, is it a Rosenwald school? That started the wheels to turn. Went to Fisk University, looked at the archives, and lo and behold, it was listed as a Rosenwald school. In fact, quick story forward. At that time, the National Historic Trust says Rosenwald schools should be saved and restored, and that started the wheel spinning for the school in San Domingo. And the rest of it. That's how I got excited about something that's been 15 years, or really 18 years, restoring the Rosenwald School. It's been something that's always in the back of my mind, because every time I go in the building, I know that it was an opportunity extended to me because of our grandparents somehow, which I don't understand. They knew of the Rosenwald Fund, and I asked my mother and father, who attended that school up to the 4th grade, did you know about that? And they said, absolutely not. Because their direction was the same, to get an education if you want to succeed. So the story of Rosenwald escaped them as well. But our grandparents knew of the Rosenwald School Fund to build schools for African American children in the southern states. And we're very thankful for that. And I'll be quiet because I can go on and on.
Yeah, well, I have a sort of a similar story of coming to realize the debt that I owed to Julius Rosenwald as a member of my family who grew up in South Carolina. And it wasn't until my father attended, and all my aunts and uncles attended a Rosenwald school. My grandmother was 10 years old when the Rosenwald School was being built and opened for the first time. She was a part of the first class of students from her little rural community in South Carolina, Marion County. And I could only imagine the excitement that this 10-year-old grandmother, future grandmother of mine, would have watching that school open up. And that's where she and her siblings and later her children got an education thanks to the generosity of Julius Rosenwald. So I think about him all the time, and I now, as the president and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, involved in the world of philanthropy and the task of always thinking about what do you do in a position like this that really makes a difference, can really have an impact. It's a big responsibility because you're stewarding funds, so I think about him all the time. And when I first became the president, I didn't even know about the campaign yet, and I was just talking about Julius Rosenwald one day as a part of why it was so important to me to take this position as president of the Kettering Foundation, is because I felt this personal debt to one of the greatest philanthropists in the history of the United States. And I'll also say that there were so many, the more I studied what he did, the more I realized it was incredible that so many black families' lives were touched by Rosenwald schools. It started with an idea between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald in the early 1900s, late 1913 or 1911, I think. And by 1915, Booker T. Washington was dead. The vast majority of the Rosenwald schools were built after Booker T. Washington died. And we all know, projects, philanthropic projects, grant projects come and they go. What was really amazing about this one was that it didn't. There were so many opportunities. It started with 6 schools in Alabama around Tuskegee Institute. And then before he died, Booker T. Washington said, all of these other communities want schools too. Could you help build another 100? And Julius Rosenwald said yes to that. They wouldn't come into South Carolina where my family was and needed schools until much later than that. The school for my father, my grandmother, was built in 1924, 1925, that far longer after Booker T. Washington had died. Julius Rosenwald's commitment to this idea persevered until the point where over 500 schools were built in South Carolina alone, 23 of which were in Marion County, where my father and his siblings lived and had the advantage to go there. So I think about the miraculous nature of this gift that benefited such a big part of Black America, because so many Black families were in the South at this time, and also that many Black families don't even know it. And this is the worst part, is that because of the incredible way that Julius Rosenwald thought about giving, and it wasn't about himself, he didn't leave, like Charles F. Kettering did, a foundation that outlasted him, almost 100 years old now, which I have the benefit of leading. But his gift was, as we heard, to finish within 25 years of his death. And while that's really admirable on the one hand, it also means that it was easy for our country to forget the incredible impact that this one man had in an entire country, because of the education of Black children that happened that wouldn't have happened. I attribute my father's very strong belief in education to be a big part of the success of his children, my 5 brothers and sisters and I, who all of whom went on to get college degrees, 5 of the 6 to get advanced degrees, and all of that, I think, is connected to this amazing man that we truly should not forget in American history. So I'm very pleased to be a part of this campaign.
I love hearing Newell and Sharon talk about their experience, because it just validates so much that I learned. Over 20 years ago, I was looking around for a project to write a biography, and my husband's cousin, Betsy Kleeblatt, who's sitting in the back row there, said to me, well, what about Julius Rosenwald? And I said, well, gosh, a businessman? That doesn't sound terribly interesting, but okay, I'll learn a little bit about him. And this was just at the time that the National Trust for Historic Preservation had just named the schools to their list of most endangered historic sites in America. and another cousin, Peter Ascoli, was writing a definitive biography of Rosenwald. And as I started to learn about Rosenwald, and I got to the part of the story about his connection to Booker T. Washington, I realized there was more to this story than I had suspected. It wasn't a boring story about business. It was a story about business, but not a boring one. And I just became hooked, and I was astounded at how much of the history that I learned in learning about the relationship between Washington and Rosenwald I didn't know. And how much of what I learned in researching the book felt incredibly relevant to things that were happening today. So that's how I came to the story, and it has hugely enriched my life for the last 20 years.
So Sharon and Noel, let's stay with you for a minute, because you shared, kind of the immense value that education brought to your community, as well as, you talked about the legacy of preservation that has existed. You've kind of inspired within kind of community. Many people here tonight, we've heard, are excited about the idea of the story being preserved as part of the national park system. Why do you think that the legacy of Rosenwald should be preserved for future generations?
The impact is immeasurable, and it continues even to this day as the community looks at the success of the people in our little community that we believe can tie their education as well as their focus in life to attending that school and being in that environment. So when you ask yourself the question of why should it be identified, it's because it's a continuing story of a contribution to society in whole, where people are focused, they have their orientation and they're beginning in some principles that are living principles to this day. And for us, our community is still intact, and we look at that building as a focal point, as a reminder of possibilities that had its beginning only through education, and with the tenets of it being started right there in grade school. And with it being the center of the community, we're often brought back to that. And so it keeps building upon itself to say, you start here, but it didn't end here. We, as just like our family, all of us were able to get a college education only because of the direction that we learned, having gone through the Rosenwald School with the family and the church involvement there to say, you can be successful, and you had the right beginning in that school. So irregardless of what happens in life, you have a focal point to say, it all began because of someone's generosity and someone's foresight to say, you can be successful through education if you have the right drive. And in our small community, that's one thing that we build on for extended families. Everyone is one family, and we build on the drive to be successful because we owe that to our parents and our parents' parents, and that relationship between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. So you just look at the building, and you have the whole story right there. So.
Yeah, and I'll also say that Julius Rosenwald met Booker T. Washington after he had already demonstrated a deep concern for the challenges that African Americans were living with at the time. And it was clearly of concern to him that Black Americans were suffering injustices. He started WMCAs, right? YMCAs, because he recognized that African Americans had a hard time finding hotels and places to stay because they were discriminated against. And so he came up with a solution to that problem. And it was that, the challenge grants that he made for the YMCAs that brought him to the attention of Booker T. Washington. He decided to say yes to Booker T. Washington's invitation to come onto the board of Tuskegee, and then to be open to thinking about the challenges that Booker T. Washington was saying to them of educating, providing a college education to African Americans at that time who didn't even have the kind of primary education or secondary education that would enable them to become college educated. And that was a challenge for all of the HBCUs at the time. Some of you know that I have spent some of my time as the provost of Spelman College. Spelman College was also the beneficiary of philanthropy. It started with the philanthropy of the Rockefellers and J.D. Rockefeller's wife, Laura Spelman, after whom Spelman College is named, was a part of the family that gave money to that particular HBCUs. So did Julius Rosenwald. But the challenge for those schools at the time was that the students that they wanted to admit hadn't been educated enough. And that's why it took over a decade for many of those HBCUs to actually even start to confer college degrees, because they had to do the more primary education. So that was the problem Booker T. Washington was describing to Julius Rosenwald that he reacted to. And the last thing that I'll say is that I'm a former academic. I taught law school for over 22 years, and of course I believe in educating our students about American history. It's both a feel-good American story and a not-so-good American story, because the reason why it was so important to black families was because there was no strong commitment across the South to educating black children, and so it took the concern of a Jewish American philanthropist to build over 5,000 schools across the South. It's mind-boggling when you think about the number of schools that we're talking about. And so it is a story that we have to remember, we should remember, but there will be those, as we know today, who don't like remembering a part of our history that we should be ashamed of. But if we don't, we also miss the history that we have every reason to be proud of and to be inspired by, and to emulate ourselves, or try to emulate ourselves.
Go ahead, Julie.
I wanted to add that it was Julius Rosenwald, it was Booker T. Washington, but it was also the nearly 5,000 communities that thirsted for this education, and that they were already paying taxes and not getting schools, or getting inadequate schools. And some people gave quarters or nickels, somebody gave his whole life savings. And over these years, they all got together and built these schools. And it was not only the school, but it was a community center on the weekends. And they all worked together. It was like the whole community was behind the children, urging them on to get ahead and do better. And so they need to be recognized too. And those communities today, the offspring, the second and third generation, they still are energized by the schools, and they're still being identified and being restored, and we're working with them to help get them restored, and And I do want to say that Newell School, the San Domingo School, is a school that will be in the National Monument. This school here on your program, if President Biden does proclaim a national monument this year. Thank you.
So, Stephanie, the general rule with my kids is that you can't watch the movie until you read the book. I think tonight we're going to grant exception because after seeing the documentary, the next thing you should do is read Stephanie's book, You Need a Schoolhouse Fantastic. I read it in like 2 days, one weekend, because it blows my mind. You know, you major in history, and how have I never heard of this story? So your book follows the paths of both Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that partnership and what made it so game-changing.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question, Ed. I can almost literally remember the moment when I'm working on my book and I start to imagine the meeting of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, and thinking, gosh, you know, they were so different. How did that meeting? Why did that meeting work? And I decided that one reason was they liked each other. That helps, but they were also very similar kinds of men. They were both very practical. They were results oriented. They were dynamic. They were used to being in charge. So Julius meets Booker T. Washington, and the next day he takes him to lunch in the executive dining room at Sears, where, needless to say, they had never had an African-American guest. And Julius shows him around his domain, which is this enormous Sears complex on the west side of Chicago that Julius had been instrumental in building. So Booker T. Washington says, okay, I'd like you to come down to Tuskegee. And so that fall, Booker T. Washington entertains this big group from Chicago. It wasn't just Julius, it was one of his sons, his Rabbi Hirsch from his congregation, Jane Addams from Hull House, and various other civic leaders in Chicago. They come down to Tuskegee, they spend 3 days there. They stay in Dorothy Hall, not named for you, Dorothy, but it could be. They stay in Dorothy Hall, they stay on the campus, they're entertained at Booker T. Washington's home, and they start to get a real feel for something that they previously had known nothing about. The other interesting thing about these guys, so you got two really dynamic guys who are used to being in charge, right? They also each had the capacity to defer to the other and learn from the other. And my favorite example of this, Dorothy's heard this a million times, but early on in the program, Booker T. Washington suggested to Julius, why don't we, or would it be a good idea if we made the schools out of Sears kit houses? So, you know, the Sears catalog sold houses. They had many, many different designs of houses you could get. So Julius thought, well, this might be a very efficient way to get the houses, to get the schools. Booker T. Washington said, well, no, I don't think so. An important part of the program is that the community will provide, in many cases, the land, they'll provide the labor, they'll provide materials. It's a project for the community. So, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And Julius Rosenwald said, okay, I hear you. And so I think those were two things that made them just an especially effective partnership. So effective that, as Sharon said, when Booker T. Washington died, rather than discontinuing it, Julius Rosenwald went on to complete it in a very compelling fashion.
So, Dorothy, you're the powerhouse behind this campaign. I know, I'm waking you up over there. Half the room here is probably working for you on this campaign. You've been keeping us going here on this.
Not yet, we're working on it.
If you're not tonight, you will be tomorrow. So can you tell us how we've got to this point and what's ahead for this effort?
Well, it's hard to believe that it's been 8 years, and if somebody told me it would be at the beginning, it's good I didn't know. But we've made a lot of progress, and it went from going and asking the states to recommend schools that they thought should be in the eventual park, and visiting those schools and coming out with a report and working with Congress, and working now with the administration. It's been a tremendous learning experience for me. I was a scientist, you know, I never was a supervisor of people, which I guess a lot of people can understand. But I've learned through Stephanie. I wrote like a science. I think I write a little better now. But so we have just, as we've gone along, we've learned and we picked up things, and we have an amazing group of people who volunteer. Maybe didn't think they were going to volunteer in the beginning, but more or less did. And so we have, it's just it is a remarkable story, and it's a transformative story, not in itself, but what it can do to people, right? And I think all four of us here feel transformed by either living through it or becoming acquainted with it, and it needs to be told. And we're working on it, and with luck, we will get a national monument, and then next year we'll work again to get legislation introduced to create the eventual National Historical Park. So with you, we'll go forward, and thank you all for being part of Team Rosenwald. And if you're not already, I'm here.
So I think they're going to kick us out of here at 8 o'clock sharp. That's what I've heard. I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for sharing your personal reflections tonight, kind of the knowledge, and hopefully inspiring everyone here to, you know, if you're not supportive of this effort, you're going to join us tonight and not wait. I mean, I think we're pushing for hopefully a national monument this year, 2024, hopefully. January 2025. Okay, we'll take that too. And we're so thankful. I mean, you know, just by all of the support that this initiative has grown. So Dorothy, I'll hand it over to you, Dorothy, if you want to. You know, thank you so much, Stephanie and Sharon and Rule. And if you want to close us out, please do.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. I think it's sort of being redundant. I'm sorry, Rana, I didn't recognize you. You're on the board. And Sharon's a new member, the newest member of the board, and she's really contributing greatly. Anybody else on the board? I miss Howard Morse, our treasurer, and Curtis, of course. So the turnout from the board has really been remarkable, and we'll just keep on going on. You know, I think it was maybe John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who we had the great fortune to meet because he was one of the co-sponsors of the original legislation. So just keep going, and all the best to all of you. Thank you.